Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I am just fixing some settings and we will get started. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to connect throughout our webinar. We should be here for about an hour and a little bit, so feel free to grab something to drink or anything that you may need at this time. And welcome. Have one more setting to change. And that's how I do it. Hey, so as we start our conversation today, we'll start off with a land acknowledgement. And it's a really good opportunity to ground ourselves as we enter into the conversation. I am speaking to you today in my living room, actually. I'm grateful to be on the lands of the people of the Mississauga, Scugog Island, and I'm very grateful to be welcomed on these lands in friendship. I acknowledge that the experiences of Indigenous people in Canada particularly has been tainted by poor treatment and a lack of friendship. And I also understand with my own history and how my people came to Canada that we're also intertwined, our destinies are intertwined. And so I acknowledge that shared history that I have with Indigenous people and how we're impacted by that history, but as well as knowing that their Indigenous people reconciliation and their truth and their liberation is also wrapped up in mine. As a settler here, I also want to mention that this community has also given so much to me, my sense of self, as well as just ability to remain grounded. And I'm very honored to be here today and honored to speak to you about this very important topic. And yes, you are muted. Before we start in our conversation, I do want to acknowledge that throughout our chat today, I will talk to you from a lens of anti-Black racism. And the reason why I do that is because families in our families that we are existed and we are part of is very much impacted by anti-Black racism. It is a term that was coined in 2001 by Dr. Hewitt Benjamin and really speaks to how the experiences of enslavement has passed down throughout generations and how it continues to impact our families, our communities, and our children. And so throughout our conversation, I hope to start in landing and talking about intergenerational trauma and intermixing it with conflict as a way of helping us to understand how anti-Black racism is connected. It can be a heavy topic, so I invite you to ask any questions or give any situations that might be helpful to clarify. And we are Kajenga Family Wellness Project, and we are sponsored by the Ontario Trillium Foundation that started in 2019, and we will continue for the next couple of years providing workshops and support groups. We do have a co-parenting support group that is coming up in a couple weeks. So I look forward to, on Saturday for a couple weeks. And I hope you're able to register. It is an opportunity to really dive into a lot of these topics and also to talk about your own experiences with co-parenting and separation and even some of the worries and challenges that you may encounter. So why are we here? in this co-parenting separation and divorce workshop. So all great relationships, no matter how amazing they started, whether it's an intimate partner or even family relationships, they all experience change. And sometimes those changes lead to separation. Through some of those shifts, it may also need to co-parent. And so two parents working together. And I'm not just talking about the coupling and the separation between two partners in a relationship. I'm also talking about parents and grandparents. I'm talking about foster parents and parents, aunts and uncles and parents, and other relationships where the child is experiencing a variety of parenting. Co-parenting has many dynamics. And through our conversation today, and hopefully if you're able to join the support group on Saturdays, we'll also have the opportunity to consider, to talk about, and to explore lots of other parenting arrangements that come out of a co-parenting situation. So who am I? My name is Nicole. I am a therapist and a social worker and have been providing co-parenting assessments for a very long time, supporting parents with developing parenting plans. I'm also a play therapist, and so a large part of my work is working also with children and helping them navigate really difficult situations. And many of the young people that I work with have to navigate co-parenting situations, divorce and separation, being in foster care, and it creates a toll on their lives and their experiences. And so hopefully as I speak today, I will, talk a little bit about some of the young people and the experiences that I've had and how it helps to create this loving environment for them, because that's really what co-parenting is all about and what we're striving for. I also have amazing roles such as being an auntie and a cousin, a daughter, a mom, and those experiences are shown throughout the work that I do and will hopefully help to guide us through our conversation. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to use our question and answer, or you can also use the chat button. Feel free to get anything to drink or anything you need. As you know, sometimes having lots of information can be a lot. And so giving yourself opportunity to just relax through this conversation will be great. So our key themes today that we are going to talk about or consider are just what are some key themes in co-parenting, things to remember. As I said before, I want to and hope to ground our conversation in just an understanding of anti-Black racism and how that fits into families. We will then talk about us through a co-parenting relationship and speak about emotional intelligence and keeping ourselves well through really difficult times sometimes, and even through the conflict. We will touch on how to navigate co-parenting with an unwell parent, which can happen, and close with restoring relationships in the family, which is why we're here, right? Throughout our evening, if there's any questions that come up, please do not hesitate again to ask. So I started off with this quote because it helps me to remember that through all the difficulties that we've gone through in life, we are powerful for that. And we figured out a way to thrive through those difficulties. And part of what happens in really tough situations and relationships, and even in positive relationships, there's a part of us that is kind of lended to or encouraged to be vulnerable. And that vulnerability can be really scary. It can bring up some emotions for us, but it also has that opportunity to allow us to grow. And leaning into vulnerability can help us to be able to work through some of the challenges that happen when we're in a relationship that's filled with conflict, or we're ending a relationship, or we're trying to navigate a co-parenting relationship with someone. Being honest with ourselves also means that we accept that we all have flaws, we all made mistakes, and that we have contributed to the conflict that exists in some way, shape, or form. And we also, it's important for us to take responsibility for contributing to the continuance of it. We understand why we do it, and that's the part of us growing, right? Um, we're not here to shame ourselves because that's not fair for us either. Reunification and restoration, I think, is possibly the most healthiest experience for our young people, for our children as they grow. But it takes a while to get there. It takes a lot of us taking sacrifices to be able to get to that point. And so being open to that, knowing that we do have to be and will be engaging in vulnerable situations, it's all going to be part of our growth and our healing. So we see families sometimes as elephants. I found this quote and thought, okay, this makes sense, right? So two families, whether they're foster parents and parents, whether they are partners who were together, coupled, and who've separated, but they're almost like they're giants of love, of support, of guidance. Um, but there's times when things happen and they fight. And what happens when they fight, it's not just the people who are fighting or the families who are fighting who are being hurt or impacted. It's really the children. It's really the other people who are being hurt in the process. And so you may be here because you're curious, like, what is the impact? What does that look like? Or you may be part of that grass who see conflict and feel really impacted by that conflict. And you watch children who are being impacted by that conflict. Our goal here is to figure out how do we work through those challenges and difficulties? What skills do we need to develop? And that's really for us to kind of explore and think about so that things can be calm for the children, or when disruptions do occur, that it can go back to baseline pretty quickly. And we're able to move on for conflict because conflict is very much normal. So how does intergenerational themes come up or talk about? And really wanted to start in talking about African culture. You know, the family unit often includes generations of people. So grandparents, aunties, you know, other community members are very much part of that family, and they're connected by birth, they're connected by their lineage, and they're also connected by that relationship, sometimes not related. And many times, you know, birth parents, they just don't have the sole responsibility of caring for that child, but it becomes a responsibility of that community, whether it's the grandparents, the aunt, the uncle, you know, there's that shared part of, you know, supporting and caring for that child. And each person in that child's life plays a different role depending on their connection with each other. What has happened sometimes in the past is that, you know, birth parents, you know, have had to move or had to live in different countries. And so I have friends, like even for a long time, that they had spent most of their life in Jamaica or in a different part of the Caribbean, and their parent was living abroad, and that form of kinship kind of developed. And that was really around, you know, the opportunities of creating economic wealth for the family, but also being able to allow that parent to work and be able to have the funds to care for that family. That sense of kinship and parenting has definitely arisen from our culture, but there has been challenges in those experiences. The challenges around when our young people are then involved with child welfare, and because of not having the positive connections in their family, and that they have to go into child welfare, or due to systemic racism that leads them to come into child welfare care And that then changes the dynamics within that kinship care home. And other institutional barriers that exist for our kids, whether it's through education, whether it's through daycare system or housing, those challenges can become difficult for our young people and can lead to changes within that family structure. I say this because a lot of the ways in which our families grow and thrive really comes from those patterns from early culture and early history. And they've adapted because of the changes that have happened within our society. There are three ways that some of the patterns of behavior continue over time. And so the one is through biology, through our genes. So we inherit genes, we inherit patterns of behavior, of thoughts, of perceptions, even parenting practices from our family members. We also learn through modeling other people parenting, through conversations about parenting. And we also learn through our experiences with systems, such as our experience with schools, with banks, with housing. The pattern that becomes developed, sometimes it's not always a healthy pattern. And so we get caught into belief systems, we get caught into parenting practices that are not always helpful. And learning about how we see the world or how we perceive our family, learning how we understand or come to understand parenting is a really important part of us being able to change some of those generational patterns. So what I'm teaching and kind of, promoting today is take a look at, how you see your family, how you see parenting, how you see children, and just ask yourself, where did those beliefs come from? Ask yourself, are they helpful? Do they help to create that sense of family, that sense of connection, that sense of parenting that you're hoping to accomplish? Or is it counteractive in some ways? And by doing so, just taking a look, just examining, just being vulnerable, it can help us to really examine whether those are patterns that we need to change, that we need to adapt, or that we need to keep within our life experiences. The other really important part to understand is that we're not one-dimensional. We're very dynamic people. We have very dynamic needs. And so I thought it was important to talk about intersectionality. And so intersectionality is really a metaphor of understanding how problems exist within family. And some of the interactions can include our racial identity, but also gender, how families organize themselves according to gender, the roles in which women or men or people within families may take. It's organized again through, our nationality, through our connections with certain countries or certain ways of living. It's organized through disabilities. Having and experiencing disabilities within a family can also shape and shift that family in many different ways, and through sexuality. It's also important that sometimes in co-parenting relationships, there is some violence that occurs. And what the data shows us is that Black women, for example, experience higher rates of intimate partner violence. We know that lesbian women experience more incidences of intimate partner violence, and that women with disabilities experience more experiences of domestic violence. Why is this important? Sometimes in relationships, the conflict can intensify so much that one person is in danger. And that's a different approach when it comes to intervention. It's a different approach when it comes to the children and planning for the children. We've also kind of embedding safety planning, and that's really important for us to consider as well. And if you are in a relationship that kind of experiences or you question those experiences, it's important to really reach out for assistance and guidance as you navigate those experiences and know that you're not alone. So I land here in the beginning to really help us consider and think about what is a healthy co-parent relationship. A healthy co-parenting relationship, as we'll examine further, really explores what are the factors that influence, that impact, that shift and change a healthy co-parenting relationship. And know that it's not just about communication, but it can also be about things such as intergenerational experiences. It can also be impacted by the ways in which families intersect and the challenges that families may experience, from disabilities to intimate partner violence. And it also can be impacted by experiences of anti-Black racism, which can create a strain and stress on the family that changes the ways in which we can co-parent it in a healthy way. As we'll talk a little bit further, also part of a healthy co-parenting relationship is really that examination of self. So how we bring ourselves into that relationship. What are some of our own challenges and issues that we encounter as we are within that relationship, and how we show up for ourselves and our families. Emotions. I grew up in a family, I was considering this today. I grew up in a family where we didn't really talk about emotions. And when you had an emotion, it was considered not good. And we had to figure out a way to get rid of them. And really, our emotions don't ever go away. We just have to find ways of becoming able to deal with them or soothe through them. And so very early in my years, I learned really unhealthy ways of soothing emotions because I wasn't ever taught to deal with them or manage them. And as I got older, learning how to understand emotions, learning how to recognize thoughts that weren't helpful really allowed me the opportunity to become, as we'll go through, almost a better person for myself, right? And show up better in my relationships. Because I wasn't always driven by those emotions, that I learned to regulate and manage them in a way that really helped me to show up the way that I needed to be present in relationships with others. Our emotions are very much impacted by our culture and the cultural norms that tell us about emotions. They're also impacted by how we were raised and how our parents or early caregivers were able to teach us how to regulate our emotions. Before we go into just talking about emotions, I do want to explore key things. So emotional intelligence. I'm going to start with talking a little bit about connection between trauma and our emotions. And then closer to the end of our talk today, I'm going to talk about strategies for children. So how we can teach and encourage our children to be able to regulate their emotions, especially when they're going through a difficult co-parenting relationship. So I found this quote from Dr. Swartz, who writes, "We often find that the harder we try to get rid of our emotions and thoughts, the stronger they become." Absolutely. So when we do have difficult emotions, as we all do, difficult or unhelpful, how we deal and manage with them in that moment is how it will show up in later parts of our life. So each of our emotions have been driven by our thoughts, our experiences, and also our relationships with other people. And parts of ourselves have decided, almost like our emotions, they've decided how to best deal with them so that it can protect us from further harm. And that's really our survival tactic. We're always trying to find ways of protecting ourselves from harm. And avoiding emotions, not talking about emotions, pushing our emotions aside are a way of us being able to protect us from further harm. What's a really, really important part of us to learn is that even though our emotions can be so intense, such as anger or shame or disappointment, they can be managed. They can be regulated, and they do pass. when our parents or our early caregivers weren't able to provide us that early regulation, we weren't able to learn how to manage those emotions. And thus, for many of us, having an emotion would be so difficult for us to manage that it would feel almost like that emotion was going to harm us. What we're learning is that as we change our thoughts about our emotions, as we learn to look at things in different ways, it can really just be a productive way of kind of guiding us through our life. And it doesn't have to be something that hurts us or harms us. We don't really need to, be able to protect ourselves from harm because we've learned to find ways of managing our emotions. So in that process of learning to manage our emotions, we kind of work towards this concept called emotional intelligence, was developed by this gentleman named Daniel Goleman in 1995. And emotional intelligence has five main areas of highlight throughout each of them. The first one is self-awareness. So just being able to identify, I feel angry. Where is it in my body? How is it impacting me? And what do I need to reduce that feeling? Just that self-awareness is really important. Being able to recognize and understand what's driving that feeling and really being able to tune into what are some unhelpful thoughts that come into that feeling. So, for example, if we're feeling angry in a co-parenting relationship, we may be quick to say, it's because this person drops this child off late, or the other person doesn't respect my boundaries. And so because boundaries may not be respected, then you start to feel angry. And so just being able to understand that is really important so that you can also then get to the next stage of self-regulation. And self-regulation is the part in ourselves that's able to really control that emotion and the impulses that go with that emotion. So, for example, the partner brings a child late, you're feeling really angry and frustrated and you're upset. And your first inclination is to, get out your car and scream at them and say, you're always bringing the child late and this can't happen. You're disrespecting my time. Because that's how you feel. You're angry, rightly so, and you're expressing that anger. However, in the process of that, maybe the child is listening, or maybe that there's a really good reason why they were late for that reason. Being able to regulate our emotions says, in that moment, I may feel angry, but there's lots of things I need to consider. I don't know my partner's perspectives or why they were late. How will this impact my child if I show my anger in that moment? And what are some more productive ways of managing my emotions? That's self-regulation, which is part of emotional intelligence. The very simple kind of easy ways are motivation. So if we're able to look at the big picture, which I kind of explained before, thinking about, how will this really impact the child and my relationship with the child, or the child's relationship with their other parent, that also helps to ground us in emotional intelligence and really cultivating those social skills. And so having really good social skills, being able to communicate really well, really allows us to have really meaningful relationships with other people. Probably the most difficult part of emotional intelligence is the empathy piece. And empathy is not, you see someone who is unhoused and you provide them a blanket because you feel sorry for them. That's not what empathy is about. Empathy is really being able to sit in someone's emotions, to be able to kind of feel and connect how they're feeling in that moment, and just to understand kind of where they are and where they're at. With empathy, there is no judgment. There is no cause to try to fix the problem. It's really just to be able to connect with that emotion with them. And that can be really hard to do, especially in a co-parenting relationship, because you often feel as though you have to be on the defensive or you have to protect yourself from harm. And so it's really hard in those situations to lay down your guard, become vulnerable, and really connect to what, say, your partner is saying, or the other co-parent is saying, and being able to move forward in that really lovely way. And if I land here anywhere, when talking about our emotions, is knowing that we cannot run away from how we feel inside, regardless of how difficult or how easy we're going through this relationship. Our emotions are 100% valid. And it's really important for us to take the time to really understand what's happening for us within that conflict. Because you can't run out a distance that which is running after you, but you cannot outrun distance that which is running inside of you, meaning you cannot run away from your emotions. It's really important for us to be able to examine what's happening for ourselves and see what we can do in terms of moving forward in a healthy way in the relationship. The next important part of co-parenting is just the communication. And many times, because of things that have happened in the past and things that have been said through anger, through sadness, through disappointments, through shame, it can be a point where it's important not to have relationship or not have that communication with each other. So I wanted to encourage you to, think about it for a second in your co-parenting relationship, whoever you may be co-parenting with. How would you describe that relationship? Would you say there was communication and that it was ideal and you were able to communicate at a range that was healthy? You were able to respect each other's boundaries and that any conflict that occurred was obviously easily managed or worked through? Or is it to the other end where there's no communication, where there's no speaking to each other, not even through emails, through text messages? And I want you to consider, what is that impact that it has on you, where the communication is within that relationship. And now consider what is that impact that it has on the other people in the world, like the grass, right? The children, the other family members who are witnessing those experiences. Communication can be impacted by so many different things. And so here I've listed, a few that may be important for you or that may resonate with you. So that co-parenting relationship is really dependent upon our emotional capacities, like how much we have inside ourselves to be able to work through this experience, as well as our resilience. It is critical, as I shared before, that in a co-parenting relationship to manage your emotions. But I also want to acknowledge that sometimes it's really difficult to do. If you've been in a relationship where there's been violence or there's been extreme situations, it can be hard to have really helpful communication with each other because of that. And so as much as you try to regulate your emotions, you're just not able to get there. And I think that's okay for sure. Many times, people have hurt feelings about things that have happened before, or they're still really angry about things that have been said to them or actions that the other person has taken. And that can, yes, impact or impair that co-parenting relationship. When there's external parties such as court or even child welfare who becomes involved in that co-parenting relationship, it can lead to contentions that can make it difficult to move forward within that relationship. I give this a little bit more credence later on in the slides, but families have a significant role within that conflict. You know, if that family member is your support and your guide, but they have a lot of animosity towards the other parent or the other family members, it can impact that co-parenting relationship 100%. And many times that happens. Many times family members choose a side, friends choose a side, and that can also bring up feelings of hurt, anger, and betrayal. Within our own community, for myself, like I have really strong values around the importance of being unity and being able to stick with each other. But there's not always times where we're able to do that. And sometimes that co-parenting relationship can really then impact our values and what we stand for and what's really important for us. Despite that, sometimes we're just not able to get to that point of communication because that other person isn't ready, or they're not doing their work to shift to be ready. And we have to put down boundaries to be able to manage relationship, co-parenting, communication as well. I also want to give credence to other things that impact that co-parenting relationship. If there is a parent or someone in that family that is part of that co-parenting relationship and they struggle with mental health or addictions, that can 100% impact that co-parenting relationship. It can also impact the caregiving as well. And so maybe that parent with mental health issues may have periods of their life where they're not able to be fully caregiving for that child. And so other plans may need to be made, but in doing that or in creating those other plans, it creates strain in other areas. And so absolutely, you know, having those challenges within a co-parenting relationship can create a strain in the success of that relationship. Another issue is with intimate partner violence. And I mentioned this before in terms of there's a situation of intimate partner violence. It can also impact the ways in which that family operates, and that a safety plan, as I shared before, needs to be put in place. So there's no physical violence, there's still emotional violence, or there's still, you know, experiences of parental alienation or separation that's happening. You know, when you're working with a situation or co-parenting with someone who demonstrates narcissistic or antisocial behavior patterns, or really struggling with, you know, being the best within those relationships, it's important to establish a way of communication that's quite different than a really healthy co-parenting relationship. In those situations, it might be really important to have some really clear boundaries in terms of, you know, how you communicate with each other, or how in which the drop-offs and picks-ups happen for the children because of that. It also, you know, means and lends to using some of those skills on emotional intelligence, like self-awareness and self-regulation. Those skills get tapped in a lot because it sometimes can be really trying and really difficult dealing with someone who's not ready to co-parent in a way that's focused on and based on the children's needs. And if you're struggling around, you know, what kind of relationship am I dealing with? What's creating this conflict from continuing? You know, I'm doing all that I can to try to like bring peace and it's not happening. You know, I do suggest and encourage people to talk to someone about it. Talk to somebody about some of the dynamics that are happening, and maybe having an additional person to provide some support or provide a different perspective can really help to give you the tools that you need, or even the support and guidance that you need to be able to get to a place where that co-parenting relationship is good for you. When things do get very difficult, the first step is really just mediation. And family mediation is a way of working together with a professional to come up with a plan around addressing some of the challenges that occur within the family, whether it's a communication plan, whether it is a parenting plan, whether it is, you know, just even ways of which the children are given that opportunity to spend time with both family members, however that plan is. Um, a mediator can really help with reducing and addressing some of the conflict that families experience. So we went through a journey. We started talking about anti-Black racism. We talked about how intergenerational experiences, intersectionality experiences impact that family dynamics, impact family conflict. And then we started to talk about, what is an ideal, healthy co-parenting relationship? How do we use our emotions in a healthy way? How do we, perceive situations in a way that's helpful towards the conflict? And then we started to talk about, some of the challenges that may occur within families and some of the challenges that we have to address, whether it's intimate partner violence, addiction, substance use, mental health issues that may occur in the family that can make co-parenting really difficult or create strain on that relationship. So lots of different dynamics to uncover and to talk about. In the support group, the hope is that you're able to really take a look at those co-parenting relationships that you have and work through some of those challenges that you may encounter and experience. We will also take a dive into really exploring, our emotions and how we've come to, the emotions that we have currently and what we need to do or what we need to work on to be at a better state of mind as we go through this co-parenting relationship. So how does our extended family, our children intersect with that co-parenting relationship? When we think of like two couples that come together, there's so much joy and excitement in their union. The wedding's always a great time. When they have that first child, there's so much happiness around them. And sometimes there can be difficulties, but they're able to kind of work through it within that relationship. However, if there is a breakdown, it can really shift and change those dynamics in the family. And within that conflict, there is always a sense of loss, right? A sense of, missed or displaced persons, a sense of grief around that relationship, and even the change in those relationships that occur. Sometimes in the conflict can be the center, and we forget about the other people who are part of that relationship that don't have a say or may not have had the opportunity to have a say. And it's usually the children. The children sometimes can get lost as parents try to work through a co-parenting relationship. And so this quote really speaks to the importance of that. So the child who's not embraced by the village will burn it down and feel its warmth. And what you'll see is behavior and shifts in children's way of coping because they're trying to be seen, they're trying to be embraced, and it's impacting them too. This is a huge challenge for them. If we're able to take our skills and work through the challenges, then we can get to a better place. And I wanted to start off with the extended family. The extended family can really create an optimal opportunity within a family who is struggling to be successful and to be resilient. Resilience is considered, being able to bounce back, restore to our own selves, and to overcome challenges that we experience in our life. And part of when really difficult things happen, there's that sense of growth, right? Which is very similar to resilience, but not always resilience. What that growth is about, it's the change that happens after a difficult experiences. So if you've gone through something really tragic and difficult in your life, or even gone through, an ups and downs of relationship, you've learned something. You've learned something about yourself. You learned something about how you cope and how you manage your difficulties. And you learned about your identity changes and shifts as well. So that's what you also learn, right? you also begin to open up to new possibilities in life. And that growth is so beautiful and so powerful, but it takes time to get there. Definitely takes time to get there. The extended family can really help with that healing process if they're there and they're supportive. They can also be part of that child's village. So when there are times when you're focused on the conflict or challenge, you have that opportunity to have a family that's supportive of you and that helps you to thrive through those difficulties. And they can do as minimal as, making sure that you're making ends meet because our finances change in separation to just being that listening ear as you're going through the ups and downs of that conflict. But there are also situations and times where it's not always that way, and that sometimes that extended family can be a negative impact on that family system and can create greater conflict or become that triangulation issue. And so triangulation is when, two people are having a conflict, but then there's another person who is adding to that conflict, or they're going to that person instead of dealing with each other. That's also not helpful in a co-parenting situation. And so if you have family members who, are getting involved and who are not being helpful to that family, it's really important to set really strong boundaries. It's really important to access and lean into your own coping strategies to help you manage and maybe even take a step back out of the conflict so you're not getting into the middle of it. And it's also really important to just refocus on the children, to think about, what is the most important thing for that child? What's the most important thing for that young person? And how can I assist and guide them through that process without not allowing some of that external experiences to then impact and derail their experiences as much as possible. And so if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And I say that with us as we go through that co-parenting relationship, but also with other people like our family members. If they're not part of supporting and being helpful, then they're not part of the solution. They're creating and manifesting those difficulties. So what does an ideal co-parenting relationship look like? It is a relationship where there is respect, that we learn to be civil with each other, and that we are actively working towards that we're actively respecting each other's choices, their decisions, and we're standing by them because that's what they need to do as they go through this process. We're being tolerant of differences. So one simple issue that often comes up is that, when children live in two separate homes, there's usually two separate rules. And children have a really hard time kind of adapting to those changes of rules. But you can't control what happens in that other home. And you can't, establish rules for that other home. But you can come together to talk about, what are the similar rules that we're going to set up and how we're going to deal with those differences. And as a co-parent, as part of it, if you're able to tolerate some of those differences, if you're able to help children understand that those differences are okay, that different families have different rules and different families have different ways of being, then that allows them to feel more settled within that co-parenting relationship. Boundaries are incredibly important, and I've mentioned it over and over again throughout our talk today. And so establishing really good boundaries is helpful to that co-parenting relationship. It also allows you to have safe space, because sometimes we may not be in a space where we're ready to, say, communicate or problem solve with that co-parent. And sometimes setting those boundaries allows us to kind of get to the place that we need to be before we're able to communicate with them. Sometimes conversations or experiences can go a certain way because maybe that one parent is a little bit more stronger than you in terms of getting what they want. And so establishing boundaries or even just creating some space in between decision making can help to allow you to feel that you are able to take back your power. A healthy co-parenting relationship is one where there's trustworthiness as much as possible that we can trust, is focused on the children and the children's needs as much as possible, and that we're learning to kind of hold back our emotions and regulate our emotions so we're not putting ourselves before the children. It's about that skillful communication. So being able to communicate in a way that's clear, that's responsible, that's also transparent, but not hurtful or not harmful to that relationship. It's learning to share information that's helpful, but not to the point where it's compromising yourself or your safety. It's learning about how do we cope with some of the triggers that we may have. A simple trigger is that maybe our partner or ex-partner has a new partner or is coupling again, and that can be a trigger for some people. So learning how to manage those triggers or learning how to anticipate managing and navigating that relationship the best way possible. And finally, it's optimism. Sometimes if you're stuck in the conflict, it's hard to think about or consider, is this going to continue? Like, what is the future going to look like? Am I going to be stuck with this person for the next 25 years and I don't know what to do? And we're going to be in conflict. So having that optimism really allows us to kind of work towards something as opposed to kind of staying in the midst of that conflict. That optimism allows us to really create a foundation for ourselves. It's part of that skill of the heart and spirit in trusting that there's going to be a better tomorrow despite what we're going through in that moment. Having an optimism really gives us a sense of personal power to learn what we need to learn and to gain the skills. So maybe today I'm not the best skilled at communicating through that co-parenting relationship, but I'm working towards that. And that optimism can allow us to be able to look forward in the future and not just focus on what's happening right now in this moment. And those practices and protocols work. When I've spoken to children who, parents separated, 10 years ago, and now it's been 10 years, and they talk about, yes, it was really difficult in the future, but things started to get better. They got into their routines and they learned how to communicate. That's what we want to hear, right? And so if you're able to kind of look forward to that, it can definitely help to shift and change that co-parenting relationship. A really important part of consideration for that co-parenting relationship is also the healthy communication. Sorry, my slides aren't changing. So communication is really the key. But it's also important to communicate how we feel through that relationship, right? So parts of what is a good communication, tell them what you're feeling. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling frustrated. Being open with, vulnerable with that person can help with that communication skills, as opposed to you make me feel this way, you're owning how you feel. Don't assume that anyone understands how you feel. It's important to explain it. By doing so, the other person has the opportunity to explain it from their perspective. Sometimes we make assumptions about someone. We make assumptions about what they know or what they should know. We make assumptions that they're trying to hurt us. And really, in that co-parenting relationship, people are just trying to protect themselves. They're trying to protect themselves from harm. And so it's really, really important not to assume. And I do that a lot. Like, you always assume what someone else is thinking as a way of how to respond, right? Or we assume that so we know how our next action is going to be. But it's important not to assume they know something, and rather just share how you feel. And this helps to avoid any misunderstandings or hurt feelings. It's important not to hold stuff in. It's important not to allow our emotions to control ourselves, control the tone in which we speak to other people. It's important to listen, as hard as it can be sometimes, but listening is a really important part of communication. And it's really important not to engage in accusatory language. And accusatory language is really about making assumptions, right? We accuse people of doing things, we put emotions on other people because this is what we've assumed. And so the connection between, not assuming things and also avoiding accusatory language is pretty strong. A really important part of communication is also nonverbal communication. Sometimes we make assumptions about how a person's body may come off, or how their tone is with us, or their facial expressions as well. So it's important for us to be mindful to how we present with other people, but it's also important that if you're feeling something, or if you're not understanding like where the body language or tone is coming from, just ask and try to get the other person to explain what's happening for them in that moment. So some really, simple tips around healthy communication. And the next is really on, managing our emotions and experiences. So this is the part that sometimes is the hardest to get to, but is possibly the most important. So being able to repair ruptures is the most essential thing in parenting. And for children, we know that in this conflict of family, in separation, in divorce situations, it can really create ruptures in a child's attachment. It can even impact the way in which we attach and connect to our own child and that relationship. But I'd like to assure you that relationships can be healed, it can be repaired. And those ways in which those relationships are healed and how those ruptures reestablish together sometimes can become much stronger than when we started out that experience. You can think about your own upbringing. You think about some of the connections within your families, your connection with your parents and your siblings, or external family relationships. We've all encountered disruptions or challenges within those relationships. So think about, how did your parents repair those relationships? What did they teach you about reconnecting or healing or being able to move on? Think about what happens when a relationship is not repaired. So what happened to your family if someone didn't, work through a conflict that they had, or weren't able to forgive a family member? There's so many patterns that have developed from, situations where we push things under the rug, so we don't deal with them. We just like move forward. And sometimes there's families where they're able to like talk through things and they move forward. So how have your family been able to repair relationships? This is important because this is what we teach our children as they move forward. And so I wanted to kind of, wrap up our conversation today with really talking about our children. How do we create really positive outcomes for our children as they work through this co-parenting, divorce, and separation situation? Dan Siegel, a psychiatrist, and attachment specialist, trauma specialist, really focuses on, how do we repair those ruptures. So he writes, repairing ruptures is a most essential thing in parenting. One of the really lovely ways of repairing relationships is just spending time, being able to spend time together, to celebrate together, really helps to deepen our relationship with each other. Having those open conversations, communicating with each other can really help to deepen those relationships. For our children, try words of affirmation or gratitude for each other. Notice when your children are doing good. As parents, sometimes we can quickly point out when they're not doing things that are good or they're misbehaving, but refocusing or re-challenging to really highlighting when they're doing well, noticing when they're doing well, is really important and helps to build your child's capacity to feel good about themselves, but also they will continue to do good things. Having the openness to allow your children to speak about their emotions and share their emotions can really help facilitate those relationships. And maybe sometimes our children may not have the language to talk about how they feel. Maybe we need to model it. So being able to model your own emotions is really important for children because they'll start to mimic and copy some of the things that you do. So try to do so in a healthy way. Conflicts are going to arise, but what makes conflicts not stay is our ability to acknowledge the offense, how it has impacted you through that conflict, but also the other person. Being okay to express remorse and say sorry in a sincere manner really helps to repair that rupture. And I know I grew up in a culture where adults never apologized. Parents did whatever they wanted, whether positive or difficult, but they would never apologize. And that continued on for generations. So sometimes as adults, it's really difficult to say sorry. And it doesn't often happen. But by taking responsibility, by being a really good human and adults and taking faults, we make mistakes. We reinforce our ability to shift that power imbalance. We reinforce our ability to create space, to listen, and to respect the other person. It also helps children to just see us as human, that yes, we can make mistakes, but we can learn from them and we can build and cultivate healthier relationships. For our young people, just being able to explain to them, your perspective or where you came from. So I felt this way because of this, or I made this statement because of this. It really helps them to put things into perspectives. It also encourages them to do it for themselves. So they're also learning how to understand their perspective and understand and talk about where they come from. Finally, express your sincere intention to fix the situation. So yes, problems happen, challenges happen, but let's make a commitment, be concrete around what are we going to do to change? How are we going to make things different? And we can expect the same from our children as well, right? A very essential part of rebuilding from the conflict is learning how to forgive ourselves, because that's what stops us from apologizing. That's what stops us from being able to move forward sometimes, is that we're not able to forgive ourselves, or we're filled with that feeling of shame, that we're not able to move forward. And so by doing so, by taking that vulnerability step that we talked about before, allows us to be able to move forward in any relationship. So let's build resilient children. I pulled this from our author named Bonnell, and she wrote in 2017 that there are 4 skills that can help children with their relationships, with, accessing jobs when they get older, or even searching for positions of leadership. She further explained that these skills can help children with people that they don't like, even as a child, right? Sometimes children have conflicts in their life and with their peers, and these skills can really help them to navigate through those difficulties. As children experience life, and sometimes we see people display these skills, you can always highlight to children so that they notice that these skills occur in everyday life. So sometimes even talking about it, helping them to notice how it shows up in other people teaches them then to be resilient. And the purpose of teaching these skills is to encourage resiliency. It enhances their emotional intelligence. So yes, emotional intelligence can start at a very young age. And it also, allows children to recover and grow when they have difficult things that happen. Difficult things are going to happen in our life. It's really how are we able to grow from it and how we're able to overcome those experiences. So I wanted to spend some time, as we wrap up, to really talk about how do we teach those skills? What are those skills? What does it look like? And here, the big skills are flexible thinking, managing our emotions, monitoring our behaviors, and checking ourselves. Very similar to the emotional intelligence skills that we talked about before. So flexible thinking, listen, sometimes we can get into very black and white thinking that things are right or they're wrong. But that's not true. There's always a gray. There's always something that, changes our way of thinking or can mess up with that understanding. And so it's important to be flexible. So flexible thinking is about learning concepts in different perspectives. Similar how we learn math problems, there's different ways of solving a math problem. There's different ways to learning a new word. And so being flexible is really important. Flexibility of thinking is also the ability to modify our thinking in response to a change in circumstances, in demands or situations. So yes, we might be used to doing things one way, but being flexible allows us to think about, maybe we can think about things in a different way. There's an example that I wrote here from an article that was written. And the author writes, a young boy runs outside to recess. He's excited to play with his friends. But when he gets there, he discovers that the goals are missing on the field and there's no soccer balls. He's scanning the field and he notices that his friends are playing kickball instead. But this child is like, I really want to play soccer. He stands on the edge of the field, full of frustration, clenched fists, begins to pace, grumbling about wanting to play soccer. And that's an example of, a young boy struggling with flexible thinking. In other words, he can't switch gears quickly. He can't find new solutions to problems, change without that warning. And his rigid thinking, which is what it is, it really causes him to miss out from having fun and then becoming stuck in that negative loop that instead of him going out and playing kickball with his friends, he's standing in the corner with clenched fist. I don't want to play. They're not playing what I want to play. And so I want you to take a time to consider. When I thought of this example, I reflected on children or young people, even adults, who hold rigid beliefs about people in their life. They hold rigid beliefs about their parents or their friends. I even thought about children who experience conflict, when they experience bullying, right? Like other person did this to me. And consider about ways in which you can try to encourage and incorporate flexible thinking. Having an inflexible thinking can really impact academic development because sometimes we're posed with problems and we have to kind of think out of the box. Not everything happens in a certain way. When young people, for example, are bombarded with new information, new experiences, and if they have a rigid thinking, sometimes they're not able to kind of open themselves up to possibilities and change. And so what we're striving for, what we're working towards is that flexible thinking. If you have a child, for example, who may exhibit some of these challenges, there are definitely strategies to support them. So it's okay to have days where we bend the rules. Like we have ice cream for breakfast instead of a treat. Or we have a day where we try new things that are different, right? We teach self-talk. So we help that child who's standing at the edge of the soccer field to say, it's okay. I want to play with my friends. They're playing kickball. Kickball can be fun. And that personal self-talking can help them shift from being angry at the side of the field to playing kickball with their friends. You teach abstract skills, create a visual reminder, you brainstorm having a plan B. We don't always have to go with plan A. There's also plan B and plan C. We change our routine and we practice front loading and praise their success. So lots of different strategies to help our children develop those flexible thinking skills. We talked about this a lot today, managing our emotions. And so children also need to learn how to manage their emotions, right? To be able to respond to situations with a balanced, sometimes, or reflective approach, and to reduce reacting to situations. Yeah, some really bad things can happen, but we don't have to react the same way. It is also about learning how to manage how you feel or watching your words so you're not hurting other people or projecting how you feel. Because just because you feel disappointed doesn't mean the whole world around you needs to feel that way. This for me was like very true with people who are blunt. So people who are blunt will just say how they feel in that moment. And sometimes they don't even concern themselves with how other people feel or whether there can be debates about their blunt thinking, right? But teaching someone to manage their emotions means that even though I have an emotion inside, I am able to regulate it. I don't need to project it on other people. And I can kind of understand that there's different perspectives to way a situation may be turning out to be. Children often struggle with self-regulation because they're not taught. Like I shared before, I wasn't taught about self-regulation. I wasn't taught about managing my emotions. And so part of the strategies is teaching young kids, children and youth, to be able to regulate their emotion. And so you can teach children how to be self-reflective. You can teach them how to forgive themselves, how to create a scale to monitor their emotions. Because sometimes, some emotions are at 10, but sometimes it's at 5. So teaching them how to scale. You can teach them how to recognize when they have emotion in their body and access skills and strategies to be able to reduce them. And storytelling really works really well. So teaching children about managing their emotions through telling stories. That's a really good way of teaching them how to self-regulate themselves over time. Moderate behaviors are very much connected to regulate your emotions. So in one sense, we regulate our emotions and how we feel. And the other sense is then regulating our behavior and how we respond to situations. And so behavior management is really focusing on teaching strategies and skills and how best to manage difficulties when they arise. For children, when they have a difficult experience or, a child in school is like saying mean things to them, it's teaching them how to best respond. Do I punch them or do I tell them how I feel, right? And so that is really an important skill that we can teach children. It is the incorporation of being able to shift or remain flexible to solve problems, to learn how to manage and cope with difficult emotions, to remain mindful of how we feel inside and ready to respond in ways that are helpful, mostly to us, but also to the situations. Behavior management also allows us to be able to manage our behaviors so that we can achieve the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. Raising children can be super difficult, and especially in a divorce and separation situation, you're going to see behavioral changes in children. You may see more temper tantrums, you may see more non-compliance, you may see difficulties with transitions. So going from one home to the other home, or transitioning to like regular things like going to bed at night or going to school. And so teaching children how to manage and regulate their behavior is really important and does take a lot of skill throughout that process. So acknowledge children for their efforts. Using a star chart or using incentives really helps to change behavior. Being able to use positive body language When we're, as a parent, dealing with children who have behavior issues, sometimes we can get really upset as well. And our emotions can then become intertwined with our child's emotions. So we're as angry as they are, or we take our anger out on them because of the situation. And so it's really, really important for us to stay calm, to stay positive, and really promote that positive behavior. Humor works. And my nephew gets really upset and he's crying. Using humor can help switch his emotions and shift from that angry state or that tearful state to that more, jovial and happy state. And so being able to use humor really helps to shift children's behavior. Show your child that you're happy to see them, especially when they come back from that co-parenting relationship. Really nurture those transitions. So if your child is struggling with transition, maybe the transition back from that parent, you spend that day doing something, easygoing or having fun or connecting with each other, so that now they're looking forward to that transition as opposed to, dreading it or, feeling that upset of the experience because they haven't been able to develop the skills to manage that transition. Um, and I think probably the most important thing in teaching and moderating behavior and managing through, separation is to recognize how difficult this experience can be for children and really remind them that they should be proud of themselves. They're going through a tough situation and they're doing the best that they can. And really highlighting their strengths and their resilience really helps to moderate their behaviors. And last but not least, just being able to engage in that self-reflection is really important as part of supporting our children in managing their emotions and teaching our children to learn to check into their emotions as well. So when children experience conflict or difficulties with their friends or even with a co-parent, it's really important to help them to understand how best to use some of the skills that we talked about today. It's very easy for us to be focused on the negative experiences or those difficult emotions. But it's important to focus on helping the child to build their understanding that not everyone knows how to manage their emotions. And it's important for them as children to also learn how to do so. These skills that we talked about today can really help, build resilience, but also help build that child through the ups and downs that occur within that co-parenting relationship. And I'm hoping that through the support group, you'll have an opportunity to even talk about some of the ups and downs that happen within that relationship, because it definitely can shift and impact children in such a way that teaching those skills helps mitigate a lot of those experiences. So some of the key strategies here are as simple as, practicing managing our emotions and implementing some of those skills. So when I had kids living with me that were very young, we used to practice, if we were angry, how we would respond to that angry feeling and what kind of strategies we will use in that moment. And that practicing became something that was automatic over time. We reinforce to children the importance of emotional intelligence. So as I shared before, those skills that, we can adopt for emotional intelligence, children can absolutely understand those emotions. Empathy is an important one because empathy isn't something that we have within ourselves. Empathy has to be cultivated. It has to be built. Being able to put ourselves in someone else's shoe is a really, really difficult task sometimes if we're not nurtured and supported through that. And so practice empathy with your children. Ask them how another person might be feeling in a show or in a situation that they have with a friend. Ask them what their friend could be going through or what emotions that their friend might be going through. And that really helps them to think about things outside of themselves and help them to look at the bigger picture. Teaching our children to be vulnerable is also we are practicing being vulnerable. So as we are encouraging our children to accept that they make mistakes, teach them to be vulnerable, we're also doing the same thing. And we're talking about shame. Shame is that feeling that we're not worthy, we're not good enough, and that there's something wrong with us. And many times through a conflict, children can adopt some of those feelings. They could feel as though it's their fault or they caused it, or if they weren't around, then there wouldn't be any conflict. And so it's important for us to teach and reinforce to children, how to tolerate that feeling of shame, but also to pay attention to some of those thoughts and to actively work on addressing them. Because in no co-parenting situation and no conflict are children to be blamed. They're not flawed. They're actually the part that brought two people together, two families together. So they're, beautiful and powerful beings and very important people. And so teaching them about their worth and helping them kind of really feel that within themselves can help to improve the situation for children. When you see children acting out or having behavior issues, many times it's rooted in that feeling of shame, of them not being worthy, of not feeling that they're good enough in their family. And that's something that we don't want children to hold on to. So talking about it is really important. And being mindful of how we're feeling. And that's really being attuned, right? Attuned to our emotions as parents, but also attuned to our children's emotions as well. And taking those skills that we talked about today to help regulate our children as they go through this really difficult experience and co-parenting. And it had to have a place in here is part of that positive outlook, but really having faith. So faith allows us to focus on the child, focus on that youth or those children within the co-parenting situation, and just really at the bigger picture. Changes can occur in our circumstances that shift those balance in co-parenting. But what faith does is helps us to stay motivated through those changes and really focus on having better outcomes for our family. And that's what I'm hopeful for all of us today is as we move forward in our lives, as we move forward through conflict, is that we're able to find ways to have better outcomes. And through our skill making that we're developing in co-parenting, there's sometimes are situations where, things don't end up the way that they're supposed to. And we have to accept that things are going to stay the same. Sometimes that happens with a partner who might be narcissistic. So the change can be very limited. And so this could be our co-parenting situation. But figuring out ways in which we can incorporate that to the best of our capacity is really important. So a quote that we all know very well is, "Grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." And we do that by using the skills that we talked about today, focusing on that child, focusing on what's important for that child, how you can help your child through that co-parenting relationship. That's part of resistance. That's part of acceptance. Resist labeling your co-parenting's character. So as I shared before, it's easy to say, they're being narcissistic, they're manipulative, they're immature, they're going through their stuff, but it's not helpful. It makes it difficult to focus on the positives or being able to move past the stress and the conflict. So our ability to show understanding and compassion can, yes, help build that co-parenting relationship, but really move us toward accepting, right? I'm going to accept that this person is how they're going to show up in a co-parenting relationship, and I'm going to do the best to take care of myself and my child so that we can navigate it in the best way possible. Remaining as open as possible and remaining out of judgment, which can be hard, but that empathy is really what helps us to move past that challenge within that co-parenting relationship and helps us to move closer to our goal. And so using and adopting and developing those skills can really help us to come to a good place in that co-parenting relationship. It does take a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of dedication. And I hope through the 4 weeks of the support group that you will adopt and develop some of those skills to do so. And that it can help, bring you closer to acceptance and better outcomes for you and your family. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. If you have any questions or reflections, I'll check the chat as well to see if there's any questions, but feel free to ask any questions that you may have. And I thank you for spending your evening with me. And if you don't have any questions, thanks again for being here today.